Now, as someone who watches this channel, or who has just clicked on this video and is now watching this channel for the first time, you probably already have some sort of familiarity with the idea of game loops. We generally use this term to refer to something that is happening over and over again in a game, and we often use the term core loop to refer to like the main gameplay loop. The problem with the idea of a game loop is when you're learning about it, it's often presented to you like this, as if the entire game is just one single flowchart of A, B, C and then back round to A again. That's not necessarily true, and it's particularly untrue of games that have like depth and richness, and the sort of games that most of us want to try and make, and the sort of games that most of us play and want to be able to analyze. So what I want to do with this video is use some examples from music and music creation to help explain game loops and the way that they work together and the way that they sit on top of and alongside each other. I think the musical metaphor that I'm going to show you today should help you to think about the way that game loops actually work in most of the games we play, and how overlapping and intersecting game loops work together to make a game that feels rich and varied. If we want to make games that are deep and feel rich, then we have to pay attention to this, because it's not just about asking a player to do the same thing over and over again, it's about asking them to do the same thing enough for that repetition to be enjoyable, and then varying it and throwing in surprises and occasionally breaking the loop, so that you are balancing something that is repetitive and familiar and sort of enjoyable in its own right with these other forces like novelty and mystery and surprise, which break the loop and vary it. So how does music come into this? Well, we use loops in music, and if you've made music electronically, you will be familiar with the term loop because we apply it to samples like a drum loop or Apple loops. And the reason I'm using music to explain this concept in games to you is that there is a relationship between how long the loop is and what it does for the audience. And as someone who has made both music and games for several decades and can kind of compare the two mediums, I can see how a long loop in either of those things does a particular emotional thing, and a short loop does a particular emotional thing as well. In music, when we have a very short repetitive loop like a single bar of drums, that creates what we would normally refer to as the groove. It's the thing that you kind of lock into and dance to, and it kind of pulls you through the song. It's kind of a bodily thing. It's the dancey bit of the music. At the other end of the spectrum, if we've got a very long loop like a series of chords that take ages to get through, that tends to give a sense of grandiosity, of some big epic emotional journey. A very long sequence of chords that takes a long time to get through. Hans Zimmer's Interstellar theme is an amazing example of this. It's so emotional and it feels so grand, but if you take those notes or chords out of context and play them in different ways, they don't feel that way. It's the length of time it takes to get through it all, and the fact that it's rising, that gives it that emotional quality. That's the basis for any piece of music that feels very sweeping and grand. Anything that's epic and emotional usually has that quality of, you know, you spend longer on each note and it drags out. I'm going to remix the main theme from Skyrim, and I'm going to do it in a way which explains my theory of overlapping game loops as we go along. So I've prepared a few things. I'm going to show them to you and then put them together in different ways to sort of explain what I'm talking about. The original track with some effects on it. And I've put this gate on it which kind of swings it so that I'm going to be able to make my house remix of the Skyrim theme. You're already feeling it, I can tell. Remember what I said before about small loops and big loops and they overlap? I'm using Skyrim because it's an example of a game that nearly everyone who's interested in games has played, but a lot of the loops that are in Skyrim are kind of interchangeable with other action RPGs, and you can see these loops that I'm going to talk about down here, over here on the left hand side, and because I'm a big nerd, I've put them in like loot rarity colors. speaking of loot rarity colors, I've literally just updated our channel badges so that YouTube channel members now have a kind of a different colored badge based on how long they've been here, and they go silver, blue, purple, orange, because I'm a big nerd like that and I can't help myself. I do really appreciate everyone who has joined our Discord by Patreon membership or YouTube membership. If you find what I do helpful or interesting and you want to support the channel, but you don't necessarily want to give $4 a month to come and hang out in the Discord, then you can just give $1 a month on YouTube memberships or Patreon. It does really help either way. I do love teaching people about games and discussing games and engaging with the community on here, and like the closer I'm able to get this to a full-time living, the more time I can dedicate to it. So if you are finding this a helpful resource and you want it to keep going, then please give what you can. Now, I know that putting the words ludonarrative dissonance on a brutal metal style hoodie or t-shirt design is a very niche joke. I'm not going to sell hundreds or thousands of these, but if you're watching this video, which is very specifically about the intersections of game design and sort of music psychology, then you might actually be the sort of person that really wants a brutal metal ludonarrative dissonance hoodie. So that's another way that you can support this channel if you don't want to do membership stuff. Okay, that's enough merch hawking for me today. So I'm going to just plop a few down and talk about what they represent as we go. So I've got these ones called Encounter, which are drum loops, and I've actually made those drum loops out of combat sounds from the game. So it's very repetitive, but we're making house music here. That's a loop of combat sounds from the game, and what this loop is meant to represent in terms of our sort of game design metaphor is you go into a room, you scan for traps, you scan for enemies, and you deal with the enemies and the traps, and then you clear out the room of whatever valuables you want. That's the kind of general moment to moment loop that is happening in any kind of action RPG, really. And it's kind of the smallest loop we're going to talk about here. There probably could be smaller ones you could find. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's the most repetitive short part of the music. So this is the groove, right? It's the thing that you are experiencing the most frequently, and it's the kind of action-based thing. Remember earlier I tried to create that distinction between the groove and the grand, and we're going to step through all levels of that. So what's the next level up from having an encounter? It is completing a dungeon, right? You have several encounters in a dungeon, and then you've completed the dungeon, and here we just have 2 encounters go into one dungeon, right? So you can already see how several smaller loops fit into one bigger loop. So if I play those together, we've got a bass line which repeats, but it takes twice as long to repeat as the drums do. Doom, 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 doom. That's 2 bars long, right? It's getting repetitive, but we'll deal with that later. So our dungeon is a series of encounters. Resolving an encounter is a small game loop that happens over and over and over again. And you can have action RPGs which are not much else, right? Diablo is way more weighted to being lots and lots of encounters than like walking around in a town talking to people. It does have that element, but Skyrim is a bit more balanced between how much time you spend in the kind of adventuring combat world and how much time you spend finding things out in town world. But we'll get to that in a minute. At the moment, I'm just dealing with encounters in dungeons. Story of my life. Let's throw a really long sort of epic emotional chord sequence behind this. So I've got my guild quest line, which I've made purple because it's the epic colour. So small loop, a single encounter. Many single encounters and you finish a dungeon. Many dungeons and you finish a guild quest line, which is what this long purple line represents, right? And that long purple line, I've made a long sequence of chords like our Interstellar example. It's sort of spooky and emotional, and some of that is because of the chords and the note choices, and some of it is the instrument, but the length of it and the fact it takes so long to resolve is one of the key points that gives it that emotional feel. So let me just show you them all running together. You've got an encounter, several encounters make up a dungeon. Completing several dungeons might help you achieve some long-term goal, like completing the quest line for a guild. And then in the backdrop, you've got the main story, right? But we know that players don't always pay attention to the main story, so we can take that away. And it changes the whole feel of everything, right? It changes the whole feel of a game to ignore the main story. It changes the feel to ignore the guild quest line and just go into dungeons and do encounters for collecting treasure, right? I think we can all agree that this is a very repetitive piece of music. It is just 4 elements, they're all looping. And the more of those elements that we take out, the more noticeable the repetition becomes. So what do? Well, we vary the elements, and this is exactly what you would do in a song. You do it in dance music, you do it even more in kind of melody and lyric driven kind of pop music. Let's say we do the dungeon, and then I'm going to replace that dungeon bass line with one that I've called town. Why have I put them in the same layer? Well, you can only be doing one of these things at once, right? So they kind of represent the same kind of layer of the loop. You can have encounters in a dungeon and you can have encounters in a town, but you can't be in the town and the dungeon at the same time. So I've lined them up as kind of variations on the same thing. By having kind of 2 settings in our game that feel very different to be in, by having dungeons and towns, we've now created variations at that level of the game, right? That longer loop, going into a place and trying to do all the things there, and it might take a player 2 or 3 hours, that now has variations because we have this type of place called a dungeon and we have a type of place called a town, and they're different from each other. Now, you could still play the game so that you are having encounters and fighting all the way through that. If you're being like murderous, and when you go in the town you're fighting, so we can keep the same drum loop all the way through, because I'm assuming you're a murderous criminal. But what if we have another drum loop that represents the time when you're not having a combat encounter but you're exploring? Okay, let's put one of those in every 4 bars. So we are spending 75% of the time fighting and 25% of the time exploring. That's a good day by my standards. It's still quite repetitive, but throwing those changes in is something that music producers are doing constantly to kind of keep your ears fresh to what you're doing. And if you would have noticed that when we go into that explore track and it just has the tick, 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 when the proper drums come back, when the encounter drums then come back in, they sort of hit harder because you've had a moment of doing something more relaxed with the drums. And it's exactly the same as the encountering and exploring that I'm talking about in the game. It's like, if you are fighting 100% of the time, then the fighting feels less exciting than if you take breaks. And again, whether or not we're using a top level quest line, a big kind of story arc on top of that is going to change how that feels, and that's what is kind of represented by these chords. So maybe this is stuff that you just understand instinctively. I know that a lot of us do as gamers, but if you're working on a game, maybe this set of metaphors will help you to sort of understand how these things work. We have our moment-to-moment action. What is the player doing over and over again that is like the 30 seconds of fun? And here, I've got that represented as encounters and exploring, and like the downtime that you get from doing some exploring makes the combat feel better, right? So if you have a game that is constant combat with no time to stop and do something else or think about something else, even if that's time in menus thinking about stuff, that can change how a game feels quite dramatically. Having an action game that stops and pauses and asks you to make a decision about something when you have been like button bashing for 3 minutes feels different from an action game where you never get to stop, or an action game where you have to make decisions while you're doing combat. These kind of switching between modes, like in the micro level of your game, can make your game feel really different. The real thing I want you to get out of this metaphor, hopefully, is this idea that we have different lengths of loops, and when you overlap them, you then have a slightly different flavor of the same experience at all points. There is a famous quote that comes from one of the designers of Halo, Jamie Griesemer, where they said that once you've got 30 seconds of fun, you can just sort of repeat that over and over again, and then you've got a game. And this quote has been used over and over again to support this idea of a game being like a single core loop. But it's actually a misquoting. In the original interview, Jamie went on to say, once you've got that 30 seconds of fun, you repeat it with variations. You repeat it in different environments. You repeat it with different combinations of challenge there and different tools for the player to use, different goals and stakes. You don't just have a game that is exactly the same thing repeating over and over again. The only games that really applies to are like endless run of Flappy Bird type games where you're just doing one thing and then doing it again. I'm leveling up in the guild and I'm going to the dungeon. I'm fighting in the dungeon. I'm going to the shops. I'm doing another dungeon, killing everything in the dungeon. I'm the head of the guild now and I'm going to the shops. Now I care about the main storyline again. But I'm still going to the shops. I'm the Dragonborn. I'm the Dragonborn. I'm fighting in a dungeon. I'm a fighting dungeon Dragonborn and I'm going to the shops. When you play Dark Souls or Elden Ring, you're doing the short-term loop of going into a place and killing the monsters like you do in every action RPG. But then because when you die, they come back, you have another loop above that where, you might kill the same monsters over and over again. So you've got loops within loops. And then you've got the medium-term thing of trying to find and defeat the area boss. The kind of start and end of that loop are kind of starting with entering a new area and finishing with like entering the next area, right? And then the repetition within that of trying and dying and trying and dying, and the relationships between these different layers of activity and progress are what create the character of the game that you are making or playing. This is why Souls-likes, where lots of things respawn and not many things you do in the game are permanent, have a different overall feel to other games. And this isn't just applicable to action games with leveling up and exploring. It can apply to narrative-heavy games as well. If you are a fan of visual novels and you've played a lot of visual novels and you want to make your own, the route to success is probably to examine the structures of those games and what in them repeats and what repeats with variations. For example, in Dream Daddy, the character you play has a daughter, and every time you go and have a conversation with a new person or go on a date with someone new, you kind of debrief with your daughter, and that becomes part of the overall rhythm of the game, which is a very common structure that a lot of dating games have. You have a character who is there in order for you to sort of debrief on your dates with other characters and sort of discuss how they went and how you're feeling about it. And again, it still fits into this model of structures that repeat with variations. I see a lot of discourse at the moment about cozy games and how there are too many farming simulators, or how too many of the cozy games coming out are farming simulators, or even some people treating it like it's some grand conspiracy to make everyone play farming games about cute animals. But the thing is, we have always had games about farming. We have board games about farming. We've had mobile casual games about farming. And the reason that farming works so well for video games is, again, it provides a structure for these different types of loops. One of the things that is satisfying about these games is you have your micro loop of going around harvesting stuff or watering stuff every day, but then when you plant things, you do it once a season or once a week or whatever the measurement of time is in that particular game, but you don't do it every day. When you add plants, you're then modifying what that smaller loop feels like. Every season when you rearrange your farm or you kind of plant different crops, you're kind of changing what it feels like to interact with in the smaller level of the loop. Most of us have had this experience in a game like Animal Crossing where initially you can practically collect all of the fruit in one day, but then you have a goal to plant more fruit trees, so you plant more fruit trees and then you do not have enough time to collect all the fruit anymore. Growing the farm, adding the trees, is now modifying the lower level loop of what you do in a day and changing how the game feels. One of the reasons why there are so many farming games, and there will always be a lot of farming games, is that kind of tending to an environment and changing that environment over time, you kind of get two different gameplay loops of what you do every day and what you do over the course of a season that interrelate and kind of change how the other feel. And that is perhaps why so many cozy games are concentrated on farming and not necessarily other professions where you don't get to modify an environment. You know, cooking is a fundamentally different type of job and activity to farming, and although there are cookery games that are more about running a restaurant than they are about kind of just responding to customers as they come in, a lot of the time when we do get games with a cookery theme, it is much more about just kind of dealing with the immediate issue at hand, and you get a kind of frantic short-term game loop, and you don't necessarily have that longer term thing of like building up and changing an environment. As someone who has been making games for like 30 years and making music for the same amount of time, and has occasionally made music for games and has even worked on some games that are about music, I can't help but see this big overlap between these experiences of listening to a piece of music and playing a game, and the way they have similar structures. The fact that music is all about grooves that you can lock into and dance to, but those repetitive grooves need variations. They need kind of syncopated, stuttering changes to pull us back out of the groove, so that when we drop back into it, it feels good. And then behind that and beyond it, you have these kind of longer, more sweeping, progressive changes to something which help to make it feel like there is a bit more of an emotional context there. I can't help but see a relationship between that and the way that games also deal with these kind of long emotional arcs of playing a character who is being a hero and becoming more powerful, alongside this more repetitive moment to moment groove of doing something inherently satisfying like defeating enemies or planting crops.